My bases sucked. Even if you paint outstanding miniature, the overall impression will suffer if the base is bad. So after failing with this miniature, I have done some research and found 4 principles to make excellent bases. So what are these principles? We will get through all of them as I make a base for this miniature, but first, what makes this particular base so bad? And that's actually the first point. You have to choose the right size of the base. Now, if you're making just a gaming model, it will come with an appropriate base, but you can also choose to use bigger one. This is exactly what I did on this model, but I went overboard with it. So instead, my recommendation is to use the gaming base or a base that is 1 or 2 sizes bigger. Because I painted the model separately, which is way better by the way, I glue it to the base after the fact. But I also used this little guy. This is called Milliput, but my girlfriend calls it Lilliput. How cute. And it's a 2-part epoxy putty for sculpting. I am not doing anything complicated here because I can't sculpt shit, trust me. But I want to turn this little pillar into a rock. So after mixing the 2 parts and pressing some of the putty around the pillar, I took a silicone brush with a bit of water and started sculpting something that looks like a rock, not a yellow poop. You'll understand later why, but you don't have to be as precise right now, but always be careful around the part you already painted. Now comes the most important, but also the most fun part of the process. Once everything is dry, you need to add variety. Remember this old excuse of a base? Well, f it. There is no variety. Because we are creating a forest base right now, we have so many choices for all kinds of natural materials. Most basing materials that I use here are from landscapes in detail. And this is actually a recommendation from Sergio Calvo, so shout out to him. There are all kinds of bark pieces, but honestly, I'm searching for something very small to represent a fallen tree. These big ass chunks could be good for representing rocks, but on such a small scale, definitely not wood. Finally, at the bottom of the box, I found a small branch that could be used for this purpose. After adjusting it a little bit, I decided to glue it to the right side of the base, but we still have to add way more variety in textures. As a foundation to build up from, you wanna use 2 kinds of texture paints. Wait. 2? Why not just 1? Well, maybe you could get away with using just 1 on such a small scale, but by using 2, you get more credible environment. Now, if you wanna feel like a real fucking artist, or a bricklayer, I guess, you can use a spatula. Not only is it easier to load your paint onto your base, but you also won't ruin your precious brushes. First, I'm spreading neutral texture for earth, because it provides more even finish, which will be great for this little rock. Front of the base is covered with dry ground, so it represents mud, dirt and stuff like that. Because this branch is now a bit sunk into the ground, it looks like it was sitting there for a while now, which is exactly what I wanted. You can use the fact that the texture paste is still drying to your advantage and put there even more stuff, like some smaller branches or some rocks and stones. As we are waiting for our texture paint to fully dry, you might be thinking, but Zumikito, this doesn't look like a forest at all. What the hell are you thinking? And you know what? You are correct. And maybe I could place there like a bush or a small tree, but the thing is, the model is the center of attention. So if I did put some big element in front of her, maybe it would be more realistic, but we have to be more subtle. So the focus stays on our beautiful, sexy Warhammer mini. First way is to add some grass tufts or moss. For these, I am not using super glue. If you did, you would get this sort of frosty effect, which is a pain in the bum to paint over. Instead, just use regular PVA glue for either tufts and small moss chunks. The grass is placed near the rock, so it looks like it's growing from under it. Moss, on the other hand, is sprinkled pretty much everywhere. I go back and forth with the glue and the moss chunks for a bit, but because I don't wanna bore you to death, all the unedited footage will be on my Patreon, which is also a nice way to support this channel. The Patreon is down there, not here. Anyway, once the glue is fully dry, it's time to paint! Nope, we still have to prime it. But hold on, how can you prime the base if the miniature is already painted? This is no easy task, but with a bit of food foil, you can manage to do it. If you get into this situation as well, you should cover a bit more than just the painted part. So not only do I cover the mini itself, but also a bit of space around her foot. Then once you are done, simply take your primer again and carefully brush it on. If you don't have an airbrush, you can actually brush it on the entire base just fine, but it takes longer. It's time to paint. Pretty much the same thing I did with the primer is what I do with a dark green color. And sure, you can use a paintbrush, but let's face it, airbrushing is so much faster. And as I proceed with all kinds of greens, I can share with you the fourth principle. The base should enhance the model. Since most of the model is painted with warm colors like brown, orange, red and magenta, I selected complementary color for the base, which is green. Perhaps this is the only thing I've done correctly on this base, because the sand color kinda complements the blue. First I started with dark desaturated greens, and slowly I moved to brighter, more saturated greens that have more yellow in them. At first this looks like a terrible salad attempt, but you just have to trust the process. Pretty much most of the base is covered in multiple greens to represent forest floor and moss. In fact, even the stones are covered in moss. But if you decided to make them gray, it can still work if they don't stand out too much. I don't recommend using too many different colors for the base because it might be a bit too distracting from the model, which would actually violate the principle number 3. So I mostly stick to greens, and there is some brown used for the fallen tree. Even here I mix in some green to make it feel like it belongs here. If I were to use some very warm brown, perhaps it would be too much. As you can see, having multiple textures but somewhat limited color palette that complements the miniature really makes it work. And we definitely have enough variety, right? Think again. I added this tiny piece of lichen which comes from, you guessed it, landscapes in detail. However, here it represents a freshly fallen branch rather than lichen. Before painting it, however, I wanna add even more variety. So again, I strategically placed some PVA glue all around the base and sprinkled in some leaves from Green Stuff World. And as with all things nature, the placement should be somewhat random. As I paint the little branch, you might be thinking that it's no wonder I selected green as the main color. All forests are green, right? But in fact, you can have brown, red, orange forests, or some kind of mystical, magical or winter forest. So you can definitely use different colors and maybe some different elements like snow, for example, and it will work just fine. But even if you use entirely different environment, the principles for great bases are still the same. The base has to be the right size, have some nice variety of textures and elements, choose colors to enhance your miniature, and make the model the center of attention. What the hell are you looking at? Now, as I already said, on this example I showed all 4 principles to make excellent bases, but I will be making more videos for all kinds of bases, including the dreaded water effects. And if this sounds interesting to you, you should definitely subscribe to this channel. And see you in the next one.